Hey guys, welcome to Megan Grace DIY. Today's video is part of my Back to Basics series, where we take an individual sewing technique and break it down so you can build your foundation of sewing skills. I'm going to show you how to do a plain straight seam with a zigzag stitch finish. This can often take place of any kind of serging if you don't have a serger, and is another way to finish off your seams so they look nice and professional inside. I use this technique pretty exclusively when I'm making any kind of project or garment. For my demonstration, I'm going to use just two sample rectangles, and where I'm pointing to right now is where our seam will go. So we're pretending that's basically the seam of a garment. The general rule of thumb in the sewing world is right side to right side. So if you have a printed fabric, both the prints should be inside of your seam. You shouldn't see them on the outside. Once you've got your fabric lined up appropriately, put a few pins in place perpendicular to your seam to be ready to sew our straight seam at the sewing machine. Line your fabric up at the 5/8 line or whatever your seam allowance is on the throat plate. You're going to stitch forward a few stitches, then hit the reverse button and go backwards a few stitches. This is called a locking stitch. It helps the stitch stay from unraveling at the top. And you're going to repeat your locking stitch when you get to the bottom of your seam. Once your seam is sewn, take your fabric over to the iron. See how our unpressed seam is bumpy and fluffy and not exactly professional looking? That's why you always press your seams open, even if the final seam finish ends up with your seam allowance closed. When pressing open your seam, make sure first that your iron is set to the appropriate setting, and always do a little test patch. You don't want to accidentally burn a polyester or a man-made fabric because your iron is up too high. Now that my seam is freshly pressed, hopefully you see the difference from when I showed you the unpressed side before. It's nice and flat, and it's very, very clean and crisp. Nothing better than a freshly pressed seam. Now I'm going to prep for my zigzag step. I'm going to take my seam allowance, and it's kind of up to you if you want to trim it down or not, but I tend to trim it down by about 1/4 of an inch. Some people feel more comfortable leaving more fabric in their seam allowance in case they need to alter it later. I also tend to sew my projects on a 1/2 inch or a 3/8 seam allowance, so I don't have any fabric to cut off when I do the zigzag. Let's take a look at how we want to change our settings to set up for our zigzag stitch. Starting with the stitch selection, I change it from a straight to a zigzag. For this stitch, I'm going to leave my stitch length at a 3. Lastly, change your stitch width from a 0 to a 5. Although my sewing machine might look different than yours, all sewing machines will have a stitch selection, a stitch width, and a stitch length. Starting from the top of the seam allowance, I'm going to back stitch just like I did on the straight stitch, and I'm going to zigzag all the way down the length of the seam allowance, letting my needle actually go to the outside of the fabric and then hit the inside. That's going to wrap our seam allowance and create a very nice seam finish. And here's our completed sample of a straight stitch with a zigzag seam finish. Even though the seam allowance is now closed, I always hit my seams with one last pass of the iron. Hopefully after viewing this tutorial, you've learned how to properly do a straight seam with a zigzag seam finish, and you can add this to your selection of seam finishes to add that extra touch of professionalism to all of your projects. Thanks again for stopping by Megan Grace DIY and participating in my Back to Basics series. If you enjoyed this video, I'd love if you'd help support my channel by subscribing, liking, and sharing my videos. You can also follow me at Megan Grace DIY on Facebook, Pinterest, and Instagram. And if you'd like to stick around for more tutorials, there's more coming. And as always, happy sewing!